Hello, the initial quote today comes from Professor Davidson Arnott. Along ocean coasts, tides produce a regular daily rise and fall of sea level that may range from a few decimeters to as much as 15 meters in a few coastal areas. The largest tidal ranges are found in Canada's Bay of Fundy, where the tidal range peaks at 17 meters, whereas in the Mediterranean Sea, the largest tidal ranges are no more than a few centimeters. Coasts with large tidal range also typically have strong tidal currents, in particular in association with estuaries. Tidal currents are bidirectional flows resulting from vertical and horizontal tidal excursion, that is, flood currents when the tide is rising and ebb currents when the tide is flowing back towards the ocean. Tidal currents intensity peaks between 1 and 3 hours after the low and high tide slacks and are usually more intense during spring tides. In this place in Australia, the tidal current is so strong that are known as horizontal waterfalls. Tidal bores are naturally occurring, tidally generated, solitary, moving water waves up to 6 meters in height that form upstream in estuaries with semi-diurnal tide ranges exceeding 4 meters. Estuarine settings that have tidal bores include meandering fluvial systems with shallow gradients. Bores are well defined, having amplitudes greater than wind waves and may be only or breaking. Tidal bores occur both in estuarine and freshwater environments. A bore is a solitary wave that typically propagates up a slowly flowing estuary, a greater distance than the width of the estuary. They are reported to occur in at least 67 locations in 16 countries at all latitudes, including every continent except Antarctica. Here is the distribution of known tidal bore locations. Bores occasionally cause damage to river commerce, and as a result, they have become targets of control or elimination by engineering and hydrologic projects. Properties of tidal bores may change in any location from one year, season, month, or week to the next one. Certain tidal bores may form only during specific times of the lunar monthly cycle, example, during spring tides. Deposition and erosion by the river may result in a change in the channel configuration. River outflow may increase at certain times of the year, changing the ratio of outflow to inflow. Thus, tidal bore occurrence is unpredictable in some cases because the wave depends on such variable properties as tide range, amount and velocity of runoff and inflow, and channel depth configurations. Tidal flats are low gradient landforms that occur within the intertidal zone, being alternately exposed at low tide and inundated at high tide. The term has been used to refer to many quite different environments. Tidal flats contrast with the predominantly sandy surface of higher energy coastlines in several aspects associated with the muddy nature of the upper intertidal zone and the lower gradient, almost horizontal, often for several kilometers. In contrast to sandy coasts, which tend towards a concave equilibrium profile, with the shore face getting progressively deeper with distance from the waterline and sediment becoming thinner, tidal flat sediments tend to become thinner landwards. In the stratigraphy of regressive coastal settings, this is seen as finding upward sedimentary sequence. The low tidal flat, exposed only at lowest tides, is generally sandy, comprising various channel environments. A generalized morphostratigraphic model is presented in this image, being the sedimentology of a typical tidal flat, relating sediment types to marine and terrestrial processes. The shadowed area is the low tide sandy flat. Towards the coast, sand participation is lesser as the materials get thinner and thinner, representing the mid-tide and high-tide mudflat. Towards the coast, there is also a decrease in effect of waves and tides, and there's an increase in terrestrial effects like evaporation. The environments in the coast can usually be influenced by the mangrove, salt marsh, or hypersaline ecosystems. The tidal surface may comprise various surface morphologies and sedimentary structures. Those surfaces that are exposed for long periods of time develop desiccation cracks. These are particularly prominent across supratidal hypersaline flats and typify the upper intertidal zone, whereas there is insufficient biological activity to disrupt the drying processes. Lower in the intertidal zone, biological activity results in scores and feeding excavations, such as by stingrays, and greater topographic roughness. due to burrowing and mounds, example, through the activity of shrimps and other crustaceans or mud skippers. In the more sandy regions, complex patterns of ripples develop, with major fields of bed forms of greater than 60 centimeters of wavelength termed mega ripples. Geomorphic elements across the lower parts of tidal flats have been little studied. These are low gradient areas, but the tidal flat slope is likely to vary across the zones and locally in response to tidal channels. Depositional features include sand shoals and shale ridges. An erosional cliff is frequently found at the tidal flats landward margin. It is generally considered to result from the concentration of wave activity or current sea level rising rates exceeding contemporary sedimentation rates. Associated with the small cliffs slumping, undercoating the salt marsh vegetation, it is not uncommon to see mud balls of consolidated mud, generally disc-shaped, as illustrated by this photograph. Estuaries most commonly occur at mouths of rivers, whereas tidal inlets are associated with barrier shorelines. Estuaries exist in a wide range of geological settings, including rias, glaciated valleys, structural basins, and bar-built systems. Cameron and Pritchard in 1963 proposed a definition for estuaries that has become widely accepted, and it's based on morphology and the mixing of ocean and river waters. According to their work, an estuary is a semi-enclosed coastal body of water with a free connection to the open sea, within which salt water is measurably diluted by fresh water coming from rivers or streams. Estuaries can be categorized by the degree of vertical stratification, varying from highly stratified estuaries to those that are well mixed with little or no vertical salinity gradients. We can see this in this model. The degree of stratification is influenced by coastal morphology, channel geometry, freshwater input, tidal range near the mouth, and propagation characteristics of the tidal wave. For example, shallow bar-built estuaries are often well mixed, whereas deep fjords can be highly stratified. Cameron and Pritchard also classified estuaries based on the ratio between tidal flow and river flow. Tidal flow is defined as the average influx of salt water during the incoming tide, and river flow is the volume of freshwater influx during a half tidal cycle. A classic salt wedge estuary occurs at the mouth of the Mississippi River, where Gulf of Mexico salt water enters along the base of the channel in a wedge-shaped geometry, while At the same time, the large freshwater volume of the Mississippi flow exists the estuary at the surface, a process that maintains the vertical stratification. As tidal forcing increases, thereby dominating river forcing, the resulting current-induced turbulence causes mixing of the entire water column. In these estuaries, salinity varies more horizontally than vertically, leading to a moderately stratified condition. Well-mixed estuaries occur where tidal mixing is strong enough to overcome vertical exstratification. These estuaries are more complex, and in the absence of vertical stratification, flow and exchange are largely governed by horizontal and transverse salinity gradients. Those more complex relations between tidal dynamics and river flow are apparently the case of Yangtze River estuary. Tide-dominated estuaries occur where tidal current energy exceeds wave energy at the mouth of the estuary. Then, elongate sandbars develop at the estuary mouth and dissipate wave energy. These estuaries are characterized by a funnel-shaped embayment that narrows in an up-estuary direction. Look at this image of the Victoria River estuary. This is an Australian river. Look at the elongated sandbars and the funnel-shaped embayment. What is a tidal inlet? A tidal inlet is defined as an opening in the shoreline through which water penetrates the land, thereby providing a connection between the ocean and bays, lagoons, and marsh and tidal creek systems. Tidal currents maintain the main channel of a tidal inlet. Tidal inlets occur along a sandy or sand and gravel barrier coastlines, although one side may abut a bedrock headland. Some tidal inlets coincide with the mouths of rivers, estuaries, but in these cases, inlet dimensions and sediment transport trends are still governed to a large extent by the volume of water exchanged at the inlet mouth and the reversing tidal currents, respectively. Closely associated with tidal inlets are sandy shoals and tidal channels located on the landward and on the seaward sides of the inlets. Flood tidal currents deposit sand landward of the inlet, forming flood tidal deltas, and ebb tidal currents deposit sand on the seaward side, form an ebb tidal delta. In this image, we can see a model made by Fitzgerald, Giorgio, and Miner in 2014, to illustrate some of the morphology of fluid tidal deltas. They are best developed in areas with moderate to large tidal ranges, 1.5 to 3 meters, because in these regions they are exposed at low tide. As tidal range decreases, fluid deltas become largely subtidal shoals. Most fluid tidal deltas have similar morphologies consisting of the following components: fluid ramp, fluid channel, ebb shield, ebb spit, and spillover lobe. The fluid ramp is a landward shallowing channel that slopes upwards towards the intertidal portion of the fluid tidal delta. Strong fluid tidal currents and landward sand transport in the form of fluid-oriented sand waves dominate the ramp. Then the fluid channels. The fluid ramp splits into two shallow fluid channels. Like the fluid ramp, these channels are dominated by fluid tidal currents and fluid-oriented sand waves. Sand is delivered through these channels onto the fluid delta. And then the number 3, the ebb shield. The ebb shield defines the highest and landwardmost part of the fluid delta and may be partly covered by marsh vegetation. It shields the rest of the delta from the effects of ebb tidal currents. And then the ebb spits. These are spits that extend from the ebb shield towards the inlet. They form from sand that is eroded from the ebb shield and transported back towards the inlet by ebb tidal currents. And then we have the spillover lobes. These are lobes of sand that form where the ebb currents have breached through the ebb spits or ebb shield, depositing sand in the interior of the delta. The transport of sand on fluid deltas is controlled by the elevation of the tide and the strength and direction of the tidal currents. During the rising tide, fluid currents reach their strongest velocities near high tide, when the entire fluid tidal delta is covered by water. Hence, there is a net transport of sand up to the fluid ramp, through the fluid channels and onto the ebb shield. Some of the sand is moved across the ebb shield and into the surrounding tidal channel. During the falling tide, the strongest ebb currents occur near mid to low water. At this time, the ebb shield is out of the water and diverts the currents around the fluid tidal delta. The ebb currents erode sand from the landward face of the ebb shield and transport it along the ebb spits and eventually into the inlet channel, where once again it will be moved onto the fluid ramp, thus completing the sand gyre. The ebb tidal deltas are accumulations of sand that have been subsequently modified by waves and tidal currents. They exhibit a variety of forms dependent on the relative magnitude of wave and tidal energy of the region, as well as geological controls. Along mixed energy coasts, most ebb tidal deltas contain the same general features, including the main ebb channel and the marginal fluid channel and the Swash Platform and the terminal lobe and the swash bars and finally the channel margin linear bars. The main ebb channel is a seaward shallowing channel that is scored in the ebb tidal delta sands and inlet flows. This is dominated by ebb tidal currents. The terminal lobe, sediment transported out the main ebb channel, is deposited in a lobe of sand, forming the terminal lobe. The deposit slopes relatively steeply on its seaward side. The outline of the terminal lobe is well defined by breaking waves during storms or periods of large wave swell at low tide. The Swash Platform is a broad, shallow sand platform located on both sides of the main ebb channel, defining the general extent of the ebb tidal delta. The channel margin linear bars are bars that border the main ebb channel and sit atop the Swash platform. These bars tend to confine the ebb flow and are exposed at low tide. The swash bars, waves breaking over the terminal lobe and across the swash platform, form arcuate-shaped swash bars that migrate on shore. The bars are usually 50 to 150 meters long, 50 meters wide, and 1 or 2 meters high. Finally, the marginal fluid channels. These are shallow channels, 0 to 2 meters deep at mean low water, located between the channel margin linear bars and the onshore beaches. The channels are dominated by fluid tidal currents. Studies of beach morphodynamics have focused primarily on microtidal beaches where the tidal range is below 2 meters, followed by mesotidal, while macrotidal and megatidal beaches have been relatively neglected. And so, the dynamic process on coasts with a large tidal range are still poorly understood. On macrotidal coasts, significant wave activity may influence the development of sandy and gravel beaches with highly diverse morphodynamics, especially where offshore waves can propagate to the nearshore zone. During a tidal period, the upper intertidal zone is alternatively saturated and unsaturated, whereas the lower intertidal zone remains in a constant saturated state. The dominant role of the shoaling waves and tidal currents and the lower importance of swash and surf zone process induce a lower gradient in the lower intertidal zone, promoting the development of the break-in slope. In this image, we can see some conceptual beach profile during a spring tide, showing the beach, backshore, including the frontal dune, intertidal upper, middle, and lower sectors, subtidal zones, the levels of spring high and low, and neap high and low tides, and the water table line in Ajuruteua Beach, that's in the northern Brazil at the Amazon region. Professor Andy Short in 1991 reviewed the morphodynamics of microtidal beaches. He concluded that microtidal beaches in Australia can be grouped in two beach types, one with high waves and the other which multiple bars or region runway develops. And other one is a transitional type, is not a beach, is a transitional type from a beach to a tidal flat. In 1993, Professor Masselink and Professor Short proposed a conceptual beach model based on two parameters, the RTR and omega. The first one, RTR, is simple and divides the tidal range by the breaker wave height. And then if the RTR is below 3, there is a wave-dominated beach. If the RTR is between 3 and 7, there is a tide-modified beach. If the RTR is between 7 and 15, there is a tide-dominated beach. And for values of RTR above 15, there is a tide-dominated sand flat, not a beach anymore. For omega, omega is the product of the division of the breaker wave height by the WS, which is the sediment settling velocity, and T, that is wave period. And then for omega values under 1, there is a reflective beach. For omega values between 1 and 6, we have these intermediate beaches. And for omega higher than 6, we have the dissipative beach. The omega parameter is very important for beach dynamics, and we will further study them in the beach morphodynamics class. For example, in Brazilian Amazon region, Pereira and his collaborators in 2016 investigated tidal elevations of above and below 2 meters and observed oscillations between wave-dominated and tidal flat scenarios on the same beach when exposed to different tidal and weather conditions. In France, these authors used RTR combined with other beach dynamic parameters like the surface scaling parameter in order to identify the effects of tides on beach characteristics and on their classifications also. And quoting one of their results, they said, in addition to the classic combination of a reflective upper beach and a dissipative lower beach exhibited by meso and microtidal beaches, these megatidal beaches show at low tide an extremely dissipative low tidal zone characterized by very rapid breaker migration. Shoaling wave conditions prevail in this zone at high tide. enough for today. See you soon. Take care and be safe.